principalities, kingdoms
Yeah,
were
there were
were
7
tiny.
or 8 British kingdoms, so there are 7 or 8 kings at least.
When you say English, do you mean Celtic?
No, no. Arthur's a Celt. Arthur's Welsh. Arthur's a Brit. The
I'm
language,
sorry,
yeah,
British is what I
yeah,
meant,
British.
yeah.
He's a Brit. They call the island Prydwen, Britain, and they are being invaded by the Angles and Saxons and the Jutes. They're also being invaded by the Irish, and they're being invaded by the Scottish. I mean, everyone's having a go at them. But the worst of all, according to somebody who was writing at the time, Gildas, were the Anglo-Saxons, who are hated, he said, in heaven and on earth.
So Merlin, of course, fits in very well. Being
Merlin doesn't fit in at all.
No?
Merlin there is no mention of Merlin in the early Arthurian legends. He's only wrapped in much later.
As a Welsh wizard?
Maybe I think probably from northern England, but there's no Lancelot in the early tales. There's all sorts of things that are not in those early tales. That it's not, I mean, Chrétien de Troyes, a Frenchman writing in the 12th century, brings Lancelot into the mix. Now, that we're already 700 years past Arthur by now. It's the whole thing is very strange. It's as though Arthur was the snowball, and everything accretes to that, and as it goes down, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and lots of other cycles of tales get wrapped into it.
Like the Round Table? Or was that part
Lord
of the
knows
basic?
where that came from. I think that's another medieval romantic addition.
Right.
But I mean, certainly Lancelot is a very late addition to the stories, and so is the very name of Camelot, which Chrétien de Troyes in France simply plucked a name from England, Camalodunum, which is modern Colchester, and decided that would be it. Camalodunum became Camelot. Well, in fact, you know, Arthur had nothing to do with Colchester. I hope not, for his sake. Dreadful place.
Does the whole sort of myth around Glastonbury make any sense to you?
It makes sense, and for me it's actually almost central to the Arthurian stories. I mean, again, what's so nice about the Arthur stories is we know so little about them. He's utterly malleable. You can do almost anything you like with them. But it makes sense to me that if Arthur is in fact resisting the English invasion, and what an irony it is that everyone associates Arthur with England, and yet probably Arthur was the worst enemy the English ever had, that he would in fact be based in the West Country, and he would be fighting to stop them coming up the Thames Valley, which is the natural invasion route for anybody coming from the east. And certainly Glastonbury would be a wonderful place to have a base, a fortress. It was then surrounded by water. Today, of course, it's surrounded by marshland. It's also an amazingly romantic place.
Well, it is. I've been there several times, and it always has. It's so atmospheric. Whether you're, you know, and there's Joseph of Arimathea's, you know, legend part of it,
Oh,
and
sure.
there's
Did
the
he
abbey,
bring the Holy Thorn?
and
Yes.
there's that marvelous inn, you know, which of course is much later. But I'm really, isn't it the Pilgrim Inn? I think in Glastonbury has that
And there's
wonderful
the
medieval
chalice,
front.
The chalice well.
Yeah.
And yes, I mean, and the legend says that Joseph of Arimathea brought the Holy Grail. And he also, I think it's the crown of thorns, which
Right.
the holy thorn grows.
And there's a bush then, if it's not
Yes,
the
I think
bush,
it's-
is, you know,
well,
was
I
a
think
bush.
I think, you know, yes, the holy thorn at Glastonbury is a bit like George Washington's axe, you know, where my father replaced the handle and my grandfather replaced the blade.
Exactly.
I think that bush has been replanted many times.
Well, you like the idea of the Grail Quest because you have recently written a book which I sold as Harlequin because that was the English title, but which in America is known as The Archer's
The
Tale.
wretched Americans changed that. Yes, I hated that. The American publishers said that you couldn't publish a book in America called Harlequin because lots of lonely women would buy it. And I said, what's wrong with that? I mean, their
Good
money's
point.
as good as anybody else's, right?
They were confusing it with that romance line.
That's
published by
right. They were
Harlequin,
confusing it with
weren't
the romance line. So Harlequin became The Archer's Tale, and then that was followed up by Vagabond, and in October there'll be Heretic.
they? Right. And is that the last?
That's the last of the Grail Quest, yes.
And is Thomas Hookton, who is your character, and we meet him first, what, in the first book it's Crecy,
1346, yes.
which is theoretically one end of that, quote, 100 Years' War, which at the other end is Agincourt. And then he goes back because the Vagabond opens when he's in Durham.
In Durham, yes.
When the Scots, thinking that the English, Edward's taken everyone off to France, decide this is a great time to come in from the north and discover that Edward thought about that and left people behind.
Yes, it's one of the great Scottish tragedies. I mean, this is the wretched French again. the French persuade the Scots to invade England.
Exactly. It's that Catholic thing. They kept it up all the way through Mary with bad results.
Yeah, and you know, and then the French actually don't help the Scots, and the Scots take a terrible beating, and their king is captured. So that's where Vagabond begins, but then Vagabond moves on back to Brittany, and then Heretic in the end is down in Gascony, but I say that doesn't come out till October.
Wonderful. Well, in theory, Thomas Hookton is on some sort of a Grail quest. It's some sort of legend of his father.
Yeah, it's a reluctant quest. Yes.
Exactly, but there is some thought that his family, I'm trying to remember exactly how it works, but there is some connection between his family and the Grail, his father. Wasn't that
Yes, his father, who dies at the very, very beginning of Harlequin, Archer's Tale, appears to have once possessed what he thought was the Grail.
Right.
And whether it is or not, people are going to have to wait until Heretic to find out.
But isn't that one of the great things about the Grail? I mean, it comes up in so many books, and there are so many different visions of what it was. You know, was it really a jeweled cup? Was it really, you know, this horrible little plain cracked vessel? Was it, you know, there are just so many.
Well, whatever it was,
interpretations.
almost certainly ended up in a rubbish dump in Jerusalem in about the year 34. But then that's something else, which is that the Arthur books are absolutely shot through with grails and you know, the Holy Grail, which becomes, of course, the great object of the search of the Knights of the Round Table is to find the Holy Grail. And this sits very uncomfortably alongside characters like Merlin, who are pure pagan characters, which is one of the interesting things about the whole Arthur stories, is the tension implicit between the Christian side of it and the pagan side of it. In fact, the very early Arthur stories never had the Holy Grail. This is a much later invention. What they did have, of course, is the classic Celtic cauldron quests. And the early Arthur stories, they're always seeking for a cauldron. And that cauldron shrinks like mad and becomes the Holy Grail. And it's quite plain from the very early Welsh saints' lives that the church thought of Arthur as an enemy. They didn't like him. All the ecclesiastical mentions of Arthur make him out to be a villain. And it's only much later, 200 or 300 years after those were written, that in fact the Christianization creeps into the Arthur stories. And because by the time you get to Tennyson, he's become this impossible sort of muscular Christian, a decent chap. and
Idols of the
as I
king,
say,
yes.
he's become gelded, you know. I mean, the French take away his wife and give his wife to Lancelot. You know, the English turn him into this wonderful muscular Christian. And they've taken away from him what he obviously was, which was a terrible warrior.
One of the great ironies of it, I've always thought, is that, you know, theoretically it's this wonderful high romance, and yet the theme of adultery is so, the whole Lancelot-Guinevere thing.
Oh, you have to trust the French put that in. It's not, that's not, you
Well,
know,
nevertheless, you know, I often wonder how people kind of reconcile it all, you know. I mean, Tristan and Isolde's not that different, you know. There's that
I don't think you can reconcile
forbidden
it,
love.
to be honest, but
Yeah.
I think that's what's make the whole thing so interesting. And as I say, it's an endlessly malleable legend.
It is.
And you can make of it what you want. And there is, of course, this enormous gap in the story, in the Ménage à Trois, which is fine, because, you know, but it's...
Oh, and then you have the Lady of Shalott over here, you know,
That's
with her
right,
passion
yes.
for Lancelot going unrequited. And I love the T.H. White. I mean, it's not the sword and the stone part I liked, but I've always liked T.H. White's version of
Oh, White is
Lancelot,
wonderful,
who
yeah.
was, you know, not, you know, handsome and all the rest, but was in fact, you know, this kind of very human, ugly kind of, you know, kind of guy. But you've always got that Lancelot, Arthur, Guinevere routine.
Well, that's what it is. It's certainly
Today.
become that.
Right.
As I said, it wasn't that until the 12th century. And that is 600 years after whatever events gave rise to the legend occurred. So
And if he was this fierce warrior, I can't see that he would have put up with all that anyhow.
You can't,
know?
exactly,
It
yeah.
just doesn't fly.
in some ways, you have to see Arthur being played by Jack Nicholson instead of by Sean Connery.
You know, it's interesting how many mystery writers have sort of taken inspiration from the whole idea. I didn't know it's Arthur so much. It's more like, you know, le chevalier sans peur et sans reproche. But is it the idea of the quest and the knight errant? Is it Marlowe? James Lee Burke credits Mallory and the whole Mort d'Azur with an enormous background for his Robichaux novels. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking it's really the quest. It's not so much the legend, but that whole idea of people striving, you know, towards an ideal, towards something
I don't
better
think,
than themselves.
For me, that's not at the heart of